Well, the real job of the President of the United States is the part we never see. It's not the speeches. It's not where the cameras are. The real job of the President is making the presidential decision, the decision that only the President can make. All of the important decisions are made after consultation with the President's most trusted advisors, most of whom usually work in the White House, but some of whom could be senators or the Speaker of the House. We learned today that Donald Trump made the most important decision of his presidency after the most unhinged meeting that we know of in the history of the American presidency. A meeting that includes screaming and insults that went on for 6 hours and almost came to blows between a White House lawyer and a deranged retired general who now takes the Fifth Amendment when asked any questions about that meeting. It was after that meeting, according to the evidence presented today at the January 6th hearing, that Donald Trump made the presidential decision to mount and join an attack on the Capitol on January 6th. The meeting began in the Oval Office on the night of December 18th. When the meeting started, only White House outsiders were in the Oval Office with the president. The two lawyers who have since had their licenses to practice law suspended, Rudy Giuliani and Sidney Powell, were there, along with the self-confessed criminal, former General Michael Flynn, who was pardoned by Donald Trump to avoid a prison sentence, and the former CEO of Overstock.com, Patrick Byrne. There was no testimony about what Patrick Byrne contributed to the meeting today. 4 days before that meeting, the Electoral College officially voted with Joe Biden winning the clear majority of the votes of the Electoral College. At that point, the top Republican in the Senate, Mitch McConnell, gave a speech finally congratulating Joe Biden on his victory in the presidential election, a victory Joe Biden earned weeks before that. Attorney General William Barr testified to the January 6th committee that as far as he was concerned, the Electoral College vote on December 14th was, quote, the end of the matter. Today, White House counsel Pat Cipollone testified on video recorded on Friday that he believed Donald Trump should then have conceded to Joe Biden after the Electoral College voted. Cipollone testified under oath that Mark Meadows, the White House chief of staff, agreed that Donald Trump should concede to Joe Biden. 2 days after the Electoral College vote, there was a draft executive order written ordering the seizing of voting machines by the Department of Defense and naming Sidney Powell as a special counsel to investigate those voting machines for voter fraud. The unhinged meeting occurred 2 days after that executive order was drafted. Sidney Powell and Rudy Giuliani did not have a scheduled meeting with the president. They gained access to the White House and the Oval Office from a junior White House staffer. The subject of the meeting was their proposal to have the Department of Defense seize voting machines and to appoint Sidney Powell as a special counsel. Here is the video testimony that the committee used today to tell the story of what happened in the most insane meeting in the Oval Office in the history of the American presidency.
I got a call either from Molly or Hirschman that I need to get to the Oval Office.
So that was the first point that I had recognized. Okay, there was nobody in there from the White House. Mark's gone. What's going on right now?
I opened the door and I walked in. I saw General Flynn. I saw Sidney Powell sitting there. I was not happy to see the people who were in the Oval Office.
Explain why.
Well, again, I don't think they were providing. Well, first of all, the Overstock person, I've never knew who this guy was. Actually, the first thing I did, I walked in, I looked at him, and I said, "Who are you?" And he told me. I don't think any of these people were providing the president with good advice, and so I didn't understand how they had gotten in.
I was asking, like you claim the Democrats were working with Hugo Chavez, Venezuelans, and
whomever else. And at one point, General Flynn took out a diagram that supposedly showed IP addresses all over the world, and IP who was communicating with whom via the machines, and some comment about like Nest thermostats being hooked up to the internet.
So it's been reported that during this meeting, Ms. Powell talked about Dominion voting machines and made various election fraud claims that involve foreign countries such as Venezuela, Iran, and China. Is that accurate?
Sure.
Was the meeting tense?
Oh yeah. It was not a casual meeting.
Explain.
I mean, at times there were people shouting at each other, hurling insults at each other. It wasn't just sort of people sitting around on a couch like chit-chatting.
Do you recall whether he raised to Ms. Powell the fact that she and the campaign had lost all of the 60 cases that they had brought in litigation?
Yes, he raised that.
And what was the response?
I don't remember what she said. I don't think it was a good response.
Cipollone and Hirschman and whoever the other guy was showed nothing but contempt and disdain of the president.
Yeah, I remember the three of them were really sort of forcefully attacking me verbally. Derek, and we were pushing back, and we were asking one simple question as a general matter. Where is the evidence? So,
what response did you get when you asked Ms. Powell and her colleagues, where's the
a variety of responses based on my current recollection, including, can't believe you would say something like, things like this, like, what do you mean, where's the evidence? You should know, and things like that, or, a disregard, I would say, a general disregard for the importance of actually backing up what you say with facts.
And, then there was discussion of, well, we don't have it now, but we will have it or whatever.
Derek and I both challenged what she was saying. And she says, well, the judges are corrupt. And I was like, everyone? Every single case that you've done in the country you guys lost, every one of them is corrupt, even the ones we appointed? And I'm being nice. I was much more harsh to her. I think that it got to the point where the screaming was completely out there. I mean, again, people walk in, it was late at night, it had been a long day, and what they were proposing, I thought was nuts.
I'm gonna categorically describe it as, you guys are not tough enough. Or maybe I put it another way, you're a bunch of excuse the expression, but I'm almost certain the word was used.
Flynn screamed at me that I was a quitter and everything, kept on standing up and turning around and screaming at me. And at a certain point, I had it with him. So I yelled back. I had to come over, or sit your effing ass back down.
The president and the White House team went upstairs to the residence, but to the public part of the residence, the big parlor where you can have meetings in the conference room.
Oval? They call it the yellow oval?
Yes, exactly, the yellow Oval Office. I always called it the upper. And I'm not exactly sure where the Sydney group went. I think maybe the Roosevelt room. And I stayed in the cabinet room, which is kind of cool. I really like that. All by myself.
The official term for those outsiders who were meeting in the Oval Office, the official term among the people who worked in the Trump White House, the term for that group was the crazies. That's what they called them. Rudy Giuliani, Sidney Powell, General Flynn, the crazies had shown up. Apparently, it was all worth it for Rudy Giuliani because he got to sit in the cabinet room all alone. Maybe he even got to sit in the president's chair in the cabinet room, as any child would want to. When the crazies left the building, Donald Trump arrived at his presidential decision. He decided not to order the Department of Defense to seize voting machines. Instead, he ordered his civilian troops to come to Washington. He did that at 1:42 a.m. Donald Trump tweeted, "Big protest in D.C. on January 6th. Be there. Will be wild." The committee presented evidence from a Twitter official about how that specific tweet electrified violent supporters of Donald Trump who relayed the Trump message.
We're going to only be saved by millions of Americans moving to Washington, occupying the entire area, if necessary, storming right into the Capitol. You know, we know the rules of engagement. If you have enough people, you can push down any kind of a fence or a wall.
A Trump supporting website delivered this message: bring handcuffs and wait near the tunnels, body armor, knuckles, shields, bats, pepper spray, whatever it takes. Join your local Proud Boys chapter as well. The committee obtained a draft tweet by the president that was never sent. That tweet said, "I will be making a big speech at 10 a.m. on January 6th at the Ellipse, south of the White House. Please arrive early. Massive crowds expected. March to the Capitol after." Donald Trump decided it was better to make the march to the Capitol seem to be spontaneous on January 6th, even though we now know it was fully premeditated by the President of the United States. So the committee has established beyond a reasonable doubt that Donald Trump knew the crowd that he personally assembled in Washington on January 6th. The crowd he summoned to Washington on January 6th was equipped with dangerous weapons. And he told that crowd equipped with dangerous weapons to go to the Capitol. And he actually tried to go to the Capitol with them, but the Secret Service, in a showdown with the president in the car after his speech, refused to take him to the Capitol. Next week, the committee will present exactly what Donald Trump was doing and not doing during the attack on the Capitol. Today, the committee showed how strong Donald Trump's influence was over the people attacking the Capitol. Here is Stephen Ayers, one of the nonviolent criminals who entered the Capitol that day and who pleaded guilty to trespassing in the Capitol.
The president issued at 4:17 a tweet, I believe, that included a video telling people to go home. Did you see that, and did that have any effect on what you were doing?
Well, when we were there, as soon as that come out, everybody started talking about it, and it seemed like it started to disperse, some of the crowd. Obviously, once we got back to the hotel room, we seen that it was still going on, but it definitely dispersed a lot of the crowd.
And did you leave at that point?
Yeah, we did. Yeah, we left.
So, in other words, that was the key moment when you decided to leave, when President Trump told people to go home.
Yeah, we left right when that come out.